Do you know what has just happened? Something that just a few months ago would have been completely unthinkable in the corridors of power in Washington. The United States, the same country that has imposed devastating sanctions on Venezuela for years, the same one that has declared China its #1 strategic rival, has just extended a negotiation offer that no one saw coming. Why now? What has changed? The answer reveals something profound about the historical moment we are living through. The American empire is recognizing, even if implicitly, that its ability to act unilaterally is eroding. China's economy continues expanding while Washington struggles with its own debt and industrial decline. Venezuela, despite all the pressure, is still standing, with the largest oil reserves in the world. And here is what is crucial. This offer is not generosity. It is pragmatism born of necessity. When a hegemonic power begins negotiating with those it previously only punished, it is telling us that the global balance of power is fundamentally shifting before our eyes. Allow me to explain exactly what is happening here, because this is not just another piece of international diplomacy news. This is a symptom of something much bigger, something I have spent decades analyzing and which is finally manifesting in ways that even surprise me with their speed and clarity. We are witnessing the end of an era, and when I say this, I do not say it with empty drama. I say it as someone who has studied the cycles of capitalism and empires for his entire professional life. What the United States has just proposed to China and Venezuela is not a simple shift in foreign policy. It is a tacit acknowledgement that the world we have known for the last 75 years is coming to its conclusion. Let me walk you through this analysis step by step, because you need to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening now and what it means for all of us. For decades, the U.S. strategy toward countries like Venezuela has been absolutely clear and consistent. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, attempts at regime change, support for internal opposition, freezing of assets abroad, and a relentless media narrative painting these governments as enemies of democracy and freedom. This has been the standard recipe, the operations manual that Washington has applied again and again in Latin America, in the Middle East. Everywhere a government dared to challenge U.S. capital interests. And with China, things became even more intense in recent years. The trade war that began under Trump, and which Biden basically continued under other names, technological restrictions, the construction of military alliances in the Pacific, all the rhetoric about great power competition and the clash between democracy and autocracy. All of this has been the backbone of recent U.S. foreign policy. So what changed? Why is Washington now willing to sit at the table and make offers that would have been politically impossible a year ago? The answer, my friends, is in the economy. It is always in the economy. I have spent my life explaining how the economic system ultimately determines political and social structures, and this is a perfect example of that principle in action. The United States is facing an energy crisis it cannot solve on its own. Oil prices have been volatile. Inflation has hit working American families hard, and the administration desperately needs to stabilize energy markets before the upcoming elections. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia's. For years, Washington could afford to ignore this fact to keep Venezuela isolated while relying on other suppliers. But the world has changed. The war in Ukraine has completely reshaped global energy markets. Sanctions on Russia have cut huge volumes of oil and gas from the Western market. Europe is desperate for new sources of energy, and the United States realizes it needs options. But here's the truly fascinating part, the part that reveals the depth of the American empire's crisis. It's not just Venezuela, it's the fact that this offer to Venezuela is directly connected to China. Why? Because China has become Venezuela's main trading partner. Chinese investments in Venezuela are massive. China has lent tens of billions of dollars to the Venezuelan government, guaranteed by future oil deliveries. China has built infrastructure in Venezuela and established deep economic ties. So any deal the United States makes with Venezuela must take China into account. And this marks a fundamental historic shift. The United States can no longer simply impose its will in Latin America without considering China. The American backyard, as they used to arrogantly call it, is no longer exclusively theirs. And when we look directly at China, the situation becomes even more revealing. China's economy is now comparable in size to the U.S. economy, depending on how you measure it. China is the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries. China is building the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history, connecting Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America in new networks of trade and investment. And here is what is crucial. China has been buying Venezuelan oil throughout all these years of US sanctions. China has been buying Iranian oil. China has been building economic relationships with exactly those countries the United States has tried to isolate. And now the United States needs to find a way to coexist with this reality. The offer the United States has put on the table involves partial relief of sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for guarantees about electoral processes, and this is fundamental in exchange for Venezuela increasing its oil production for global markets. But we all know that increasing Venezuelan oil production requires massive investment, technology, and time. And who has the capital and willingness to invest in Venezuela right now? China. So, what is really happening here is that the United States is indirectly but undeniably acknowledging that it needs Chinese cooperation to achieve its objectives in Venezuela. This is extraordinary. 5 years ago, if I had said this at a conference, people would have thought I was wildly speculating. But here we are. And let me go deeper into what this means for the state of the American empire, because we need to be completely honest about what we are witnessing. An empire at its peak does not negotiate with its adversaries from a position of need, it dictates terms from a position of strength. The United States in 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did not need to make offers like this. The United States in 1990 was the undisputed hegemonic power, the only global superpower, and it acted as such. It imposed its will through the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, all institutions it dominated, and through which it forced neoliberal policies on the developing world. And if that didn't work, well, there was always the military option. Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, the list goes on. But something fundamental has changed in the last 2 decades, and especially in the last 5 years. The U.S. ability to unilaterally impose its will has eroded dramatically. And it's not just about China, although China is obviously the most important factor. It's about a broader change in the global balance of economic power. The Global South, as we now call it, has strengthened. Brazil, India, South Africa, Indonesia, these countries are no longer passive recipients of policies dictated from Washington or international financial institutions. They have their own agendas, their own interests, and increasingly the economic capacity to pursue those interests independently of what Washington prefers. And the irony here, the deep historical irony, is that this shift is largely the result of U.S. policies themselves. For decades, American corporations moved production abroad in search of cheaper labor and higher profits. China became the factory of the world precisely because American capital invested massively there. And now, decades later, the United States wakes up to realize that it has created an economic competitor it can no longer control. This is the central contradiction of capitalism that I have been teaching for 50 years. Capitalism constantly creates the conditions for its own transformation. Corporations, in their relentless pursuit of profit, undermine the very power structures that protect them. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, the U.S. still has the most powerful military in the world, bases in more than 70 countries, the ability to project power in ways no other country can. And you'd be right, the military power of the United States remains formidable. But here's the problem. Military power alone cannot sustain an empire in the 21st century. This is not the 19th century, when the British could simply send gunboats and force China to open its ports to the opium trade. The world is more complex now, more interconnected, and the use of military force has enormous political and economic costs. Afghanistan demonstrated this clearly. 20 years, $2 trillion, thousands of American lives lost. And the result? The Taliban are back in power, and the United States withdrew in defeat. Iraq, similar. Libya, a complete disaster. Military power can destroy, but it cannot build the kind of stable hegemonic order the U.S. needs to maintain its global position. So let's return to this specific offer to China and Venezuela, because we need to understand the details to grasp the full picture. What the United States is essentially proposing is a framework in which it can ease some sanctions on Venezuela, allow an increase in Venezuelan oil production to help stabilize global energy markets, and do all this while maintaining some degree of influence over Venezuela's internal political processes. At the same time, the U.S. is signaling to China that it is willing to be more pragmatic, more flexible in its approach to countries where China has significant economic interests. This is, in essence, an acknowledgement that the U.S. and China will have to find ways to coexist and cooperate in certain areas even while competing in others. But here is the fundamental question we should be asking. Is this enough? Can the United States truly stabilize its global position through these kinds of tactical adjustments? My answer, based on decades of analysis of capitalism and imperial systems, is no, not in the long term. Because the fundamental problems the United States faces are not foreign policy issues. They are deep structural problems of American capitalism itself: massive inequality within the U.S., the collapse of the middle class, deindustrialization, a dysfunctional political system completely captured by corporate interests and dark money, and a crisis of legitimacy for democratic institutions. All of these are symptoms of a system in profound crisis. And when a system is in crisis, when contradictions become unsustainable, is when we see these moments of dramatic historical change. We have seen this before. The British Empire in the decades after World War I, unable to maintain its global position, gradually ceded power until after World War II, it had to acknowledge that its imperial era was over. Look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, a system that seemed permanent, powerful, and suddenly, within a few years, disintegrated. Now, I am not predicting that the United States will collapse in the same way. History never repeats itself exactly. But I am saying that we are in a moment of fundamental historical transition, and this offer to China and Venezuela is one of the visible markers of that transition. And let me be clear about something else, because I know some of you might think I am celebrating this, that I am happy to see the decline of U.S. power. It's not that simple. I am a critic of the American empire, I am a critic of capitalism, but I also understand that historical transitions are dangerous periods. When the established order collapses but the new order has not yet taken shape, there is room for chaos, conflict, massive human suffering. The transition from British to American hegemony involved 2 world wars. I do not want to see something like that repeated. What I want, what I have advocated for my entire life, is a conscious, democratic transformation toward a more just, more equal, more sustainable system. And that requires people to understand what is happening, to clearly see the forces at play, to organize and fight for alternatives. Because here's the thing, China is not the answer. Replacing American hegemony with Chinese hegemony does not solve the fundamental problems. China has its own state capitalist system, its own hierarchies, its own contradictions. What we need is not a new empire. We need to move beyond the system of empires entirely. We need to build a multipolar world, yes, but a multipolar world based on genuine cooperation, mutual respect, and recognition that the challenges we face as a species, climate change, global inequality, pandemics, cannot be solved by any nation acting alone. They cannot be solved within the framework of competitive capitalism. And Venezuela, in all this, represents something important. Venezuela, under Chavez and later under Maduro, attempted to build an alternative model, what they called 21st century socialism. Now, we can debate how successful that project has been. We can point to errors and problems, and certainly there have been many. But the fundamental point is that Venezuela dared to challenge the neoliberal model. It dared to say that the country's natural resources should benefit the Venezuelan people, not just multinational corporations. And for that, it was punished brutally. U.S. sanctions against Venezuela have been devastating. They have caused massive human suffering, collapsed the economy, and all of this was done in the name of democracy and human rights. But the reality is that it was punishment for challenging the dominant economic order. So when the United States now offers to ease some of those sanctions, what should we think of that? On one hand, any relief for the Venezuelan people is welcome. The sanctions should never have been imposed in the first place. But on the other hand, we need to be skeptical of the motivations.